This bit won't be in the podcast itself, but what I've always tried to do with these interviews, and it's variously successful, is try to start off by just having a sense of something that, for me at least, holds a lot of your work together.
Mhm.
So a kind of a starting entry point, if you will. And the thing that really has always struck me about your work, amongst many things, but one of the things that I always come back to is how you seem to want to bring things, you want to make practical use of these ideas.
Mm.
You want to do something with them. And one of the questions I wanted to ask you, and I was going to leave it till later on, but I'll just ask you now, is if you're a practically minded person and you're thinking of doing something practical in the world, you'd be a firefighter or you'd be like a carpenter or something. What would make you go to philosophy, which everybody thinks of as the least practical subject and is the most esoteric and abstract subject of all?
Uh, I don't know that I would think of myself as practically minded, although I did grow up on a farm, so there was some aspects of practicality that were kind of ingrained in me growing up, that's for sure. Um, I don't think I ever went into philosophy with a practical view in mind. I guess I would say two things. One is the research funding environment in Australia is such that it's almost impossible to get money for doing pure research. So if you just want to research Deleuze because you like French philosophy, the research funding people would be like, well, that's fine, but you are never getting funding. So we're constantly pushed to try to show the value of it. And I kind of resisted and resented that for a long time, and I still do. But I also thought, well, what if we took it seriously and thought, well, maybe it should be the case that we should be able to do something useful with this work that didn't at the same time lead to a kind of instrumentalization of it or a sort of banalization of it as well. Um, and then I also, as I started to think about it more, I realized, and I was saying this to a group of students yesterday, there's probably no more important work that we can do as scholars in the humanities, but also just as people regularly, than to think hard about how concepts are formed, how they operate in the world. So, for instance, concepts like justice and fairness and so on, they are concepts. They're not sort of material things, but they have enormous practical effects. So I think that philosophy, in fact, is a highly practical kind of discipline. You think about it in terms of notions of justice, of fairness, of ethics, and those are just the most obvious ones. But almost all transformations of society have begun as ideas. So I think that philosophy, or just critical thinking in general, is at its foundation practical.
There's degrees to which that's used, though, and I think the three writers that I've heard you talk quite a bit about, and they're featured in here, Deleuze, de Certeau, and Jameson, particularly Jameson, would be very much associated with a kind of classical kind of Marxist critical position. But I don't really know Certeau very well, but you wouldn't position Deleuze as being classically critical in that sense, would you? Or would you?
I think I would. I mean, I think that's his whole point about inventing concepts. That by he sort of says the point of philosophy is to invent concepts, but the point of concepts is to help us to not simply understand the world, but actually to see the world. And it's only by seeing the world in a new way that we could begin to think about how we might change it. So I've never quite bought into that whole Marxist idea that, the point of philosophy is not to think about the world, but to change it. I don't think you can change the world without first of all thinking about it. Just blind change is not really what we need. And we don't live in such simple times that you could easily change anything. So it requires quite considerable thought at this point in time, I would say.
And is there something about those three authors particularly, and we are going to talk about those three works that you've cited of theirs one by one, but collectively, de Soto, Deleuze, Jameson, that answer that question for you particularly as much as others or more than others, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, they're kind of, a lot of people would see them as a weird constellation, but
Mm.
in fact, when Jameson was working at the University of San Diego, Michel de Certeau came there as a visiting professor, and Jameson translated the first of his works into English. And also Jameson wrote the first blurb for Anti-Oedipus to try to encourage, and it was his student, Brian Masumi, that translated A Thousand Plateaus and brought that into English. So actually there is a very strong sort of, I guess, subterranean connection between them. In terms of, and everyone seems to think that they're radically different, but if you talk to Jameson himself, and I've been fortunate enough to be able to do that, he's a great admirer of Deleuze's work and a great critic of it as well. He has his disagreements, but he's also a great admirer. As he often says, Deleuze only wrote like 5 pages about, Alfred Hitchcock, but it's the best 5 pages anybody wrote. So pretty high praise. And he's also quite an admirer of Michel de Certeau's work on the practice of everyday life. I mean, for me, I came to Jameson quite late in my academic career, after I'd already written my PhD, in fact. And what I got from his work, which I tried to put into the book Deleuzeism, but I think most people sort of hate it about that book, is that that Jameson treats every form of philosophy, every critical thinker, as writing in their own kind of language. And I've always found that to be quite a powerful idea. And so he uses the term transcoding, which he takes from Deleuze anyway, but he talks about it as, every philosopher wants to try to talk about the world, but has to do so in their own way. And that there is a kind of a gap between each work that we are always trying to bridge, but not to ultimately render them as though they all say the same thing. So I've always been sort of quite attracted to that idea that we have to learn each philosophy as a kind of language unto itself, that we then use to decode the world in a particular kind of way. And therefore we can read multiple philosophers alongside each other as to create a kind of multidimensional picture of the world, without trying to sort of say, well, there is this thing that's in common between them all and we can reduce it all down to one language. And I think he was always very clear about that. It's neither possible nor desirable.
Now, I've heard you say before that you feel closest maybe to Jameson of all those three, but of course it's the work you've done with Deleuze, the Deleuze and Guattari Studies Journal and the Deleuze Camp that probably a lot of people will know you for. How long have you been doing those things for now?
I started the first Deleuze camp in 2007, and then the journal and the conferences kicked off the following year. So since 2008. But I was already editing book series from about, I think the first one came out in 98 or 99. So yeah, a long time now, it seems.
All right, so let's dig into your 5 things. The first piece that you suggested was Michel de Certeau's The Practice of Everyday Life. Now, published in 1980. Why this?
So I had kind of come across it as an undergraduate in fragments, and I had decided I wanted to write a PhD about the notion of everyday life. I suppose partly inspired by de Certeau, but also Henri Lefebvre and other people as well. And then purely by chance, my wife happened to be in a bookshop and she saw the book on the shelf and thought that would be something that I would like, not actually knowing who de Certeau was or why I might ever want to read it. But anyway, she just randomly bought it for me and brought it home. And I was just like completely surprised by it, because I didn't really think that a book like that would even be available in a bookshop. I mean, this is long before Amazon and books and, just the sort of the idea that you can find anything that you want on the internet. And so I had the opportunity then to read the whole book, and it just really kind of struck me as, on the one hand, I couldn't help but admire just the erudition of it, just the sort of easy way by which he talked about all these things that I had never heard of, never read, etc., etc. A lot of them drawn from theological texts because he was a Jesuit. But also, I quite like the idea of the sort of dialectic he constructs between the notion of strategy and tactics, and his distinctions between place and space, and what he was trying to do. And this work sort of came out of, and it was kind of a response to May 68, although I didn't know that at the time. But what he was trying to talk about was the way by which, even if we sort of live in what we think of as oppressive circumstances, we are always constantly finding ways to create spaces for ourselves that are spaces for the imagination, spaces for hope, and ultimately spaces for transformation. So I found that quite exciting to read about as a young PhD student. I think later on I became a bit more critical of that as being perhaps too simplistic, but when I first read it, it was really exciting. And I also liked the way he wanted to talk about the possibility of there being a sort of grammar of walking in the city, which he kind of throws out in a very speculative way and doesn't really develop. But for me, it was a sort of defamiliarization of thinking about how we might write about just the fact of being in a city.
So the stuff that you were talking about, the transformational possibilities that are available to people or emerge for people or they create, these are the tactics he talked about as opposed to the strategies that might be more hegemonic and top down, if you will.
Yeah, so strategy is, for him, the textbook example of strategy is Foucault's idea of discipline. But then, he comes up with as an idea of tactics that even if we live in a surveillance universe, then people at work are always finding ways of not really doing what they're supposed to be doing. And if you sort of follow the trend or thinking about what has been happening in the digital space, the surveillance is becoming ever more pervasive, such that even the keystrokes on your laptop can now be recorded and investigated. But prior to that, there's plenty of people, even my students, I look around the room and they're not taking notes, they're on Facebook or they're doing some online shopping or whatever. So he was quite interested in that sort of what we would now call multi-presencing, but then we didn't have that term. But the way by which people are kind of simultaneously participating in the class or work or whatever, but also doing something else that's kind of for themselves. And he was quite interested in the notion of what in French is called la perruque, which is called wigging it, but we would basically see it as theft. So I don't know, I have, friends and relatives that are tradies, and very often, houses and garden sheds get built with the offcuts from other jobs that I've done elsewhere, and you sort of think, oh, how'd you build that shed? And go, oh, well, we had a little bit of leftover timber from this and a bit of leftover from there and there and there. And so he was quite interested in these sort of makeshift ways of sort of surviving and thriving in a set of circumstances that weren't necessarily conducive to that otherwise.
Did he have any problems with the idea of grand transformative change? Was he opposed to the idea of revolution? Did he see that? Did his work on the sort of everydayness of transformation undercut that to some extent? I mean, particularly in the post-68 period when there was a lot of critique of Marxism. I mean, when you were talking about resistance, reminded me a lot of the ways of Foucault's written about material practices, about focusing on the material, the doing, rather than what people say they do, but the everydayness of the doing. But Foucault has been criticized for taking the legs out from underneath those who would argue for a grand social transformation, hasn't he? Would de Soto be the same?
Oh, I would think so. He was quite interested in May 68, but as a kind of grassroots transformation rather than a revolution. And I would say, Deleuze says somewhere, neither revolution nor reform. And I think that Foucault and de Soto would probably agree with that, which is revolution, if it means killing people, they're not interested. And reform, is equally problematic because you can't reform anything without also preserving the status quo. So neither revolution nor reform. So where do you go from there? I think de Soto is kind of not really interested in grand transformations and probably didn't believe in them, but was quite interested in the ways by which people are able to sort of make do under difficult circumstances. But also he was interested in policy, which has a sort of reformist dimension, and the ways by which policies could be created that would be could mitigate or otherwise improve people's circumstances. But certainly I would be fairly comfortable in saying he wasn't interested in major revolutions.
Well, there's a very fancy segue there, because I was going to ask you about your cycling. A lot of the work you've been doing in recent times, a lot of the published work, has been around urban cycling and access to urban cycling. I mean, in terms of an everyday transformative action, it fits in very much with that kind of everyday practices of de Soto. Why cycling? Obviously, you're a very keen cyclist yourself.
I mean, partly it was because we got a research grant to do it, but we applied for the money because we saw I was interested in cycling as just the thing that I do. But we also saw that there was kind of a niche conversation to be had, because cycling, as a mode of transport is an obvious solution to reducing CO2 emissions, to reducing congestion in the city, to make life generally more livable. And Copenhagen and Amsterdam are just living embodiments of the proof of that. Like, you only have to visit those cities to see, well, it would be great. So we were kind of like, I was particularly interested in it because on the one hand, it is like an obvious solution. So the real question for me was, why can't we, as a nation, as a city in Australia, not see and therefore do the obvious things? And for me, that is the larger question to do with all forms of climate change. It's not like we don't know either what the problem is or indeed what the solution is, but we just keep finding ways of not doing the things that are manifestly obvious that we must do. And I've always liked Deleuze and Guattari's phrase that capitalism is always entails the manufacture of stupidity. And it's just so obvious that that's kind of, you look at Australian cities and you think these are ridiculous. They've just spent, would cost more than $1 billion a kilometre to build all these new tunnels in Sydney, to try to cope with the ridiculous amount of traffic that we have. And you think, well, it costs approximately $1 million a kilometre to build a cycle path. So for the equivalent money, they could have had a network of several thousand kilometres of bike paths, which would have taken far more cars off the street and would reduce congestion far more successfully, reduce emissions, etc., etc., etc. And yet no one would even in their wildest dreams imagine that any Australian politician would contemplate doing that. And so we kind of get stuck in this cycle of, well, capitalism decides, which way forward. Like we have in my area, there's a kind of proposal to put offshore wind farms, and all the local greenies are like, oh, we should have offshore wind farms, they're so good, and that sort of thing. And I've been really skeptical about it because I don't really trust capitalism in general. And so I did some research about it, and to build these wind farms will cost upwards of $40 billion. Now, there is no way they're going to build wind farms costing $40 billion without also extracting price guarantees, levies, sweetheart loans from the government, etc., etc. So the only real kind of interest in doing any of that has nothing to do with the environment. It's like hedge funds. It's a hedge fund kind of boondoggle. And so I think the kind of greenies and green consciousness really needs to kind of wake up to the fact that it's capitalism more than anything that is interested in these kinds of things. And they're sort of using environmental concern and consciousness as simply a way of kind of legitimating their business deals. So I think we need to be a lot more critical of those kinds of things. So I'm not sure how we got to wind farms from cycling, but it is the larger concern for trying to understand this process of being actively resistant to the obvious things we should do.
Well, I'm obviously majoring on segues today because I thought we'd move on to the second of your texts, your books that you've suggested, and that comes from Deleuze and Guattari. It was the first of their Schizophrenia and Capitalism series. It's Anti-Oedipus. Oedipus, which do you say?
I usually say Oedipus, but
Oedipus.
I don't think there's any hard and fast rule.
Right or wrong. Oedipus, one of their landmark texts, one of the ones that most people who know anything about Deleuze and Guattari know. Why that one?
I mean, there's a funny story to me anyway, because I was working on reading Michel de Certeau. This was when I was doing my PhD, and quite interested in notions of everyday life. And there were other PhD students in my kind of university at the time who kept telling me that I should read it. And I kind of assumed that, to use a phrase that was created later, that it was almost certainly going to be fashionable nonsense. So I didn't want to read it, and I didn't immediately read it. But eventually I realized that the only way I could reject it was to read it and then tell everybody that it really was fashionable nonsense. So I did finally get around to buying a copy and reading it. And within, I don't know, 5 pages, I was just kind of like, wow, this stuff is just crazy and amazing. And also it was kind of simultaneously exhilarating and frustrating, because on the one hand, you sort of had the sense that you were understanding something, but you also had the near certainty that you really didn't understand it. And like that sort of frustrated me a lot, and so much so that I kind of like, no, I've really got to understand this text. Why don't I understand it? What don't I know? What do I need to know in order to understand it? So it kind of really drove me to read a whole bunch of new stuff. So and I think that's one of the things that I find quietly frustrating about students that I encounter now. You send them a text like that, and they're like, oh, I can't understand it. The writer is stupid. Why don't they make their point clearer? And I think, well, when I was a student, I took that on board as meaning I was the one that was stupid, and I needed to go and do more work and go and read and so forth. And in the time that I've been a teacher, that has completely reversed. Like I think 25 years ago, students generally thought, yeah, I don't understand it. That's obviously because, I don't know anything. I need to go and read some more, and then I will understand it. Now my students are like, I don't understand it. The writer's stupid. Can you give us a different text that's, easier to digest? And think, well, we're missing something in that encounter with difficulty and that encounter with complexity if we're just too kind of quick to dismiss these things as just being, well, it's just too hard. So I think that was what I really liked about Anti-Oedipus, that it's a poetic text as much as anything. And a lot of it is written as a kind of internal stream of consciousness. And so you've got to read it a bit like you would be reading Joyce or something, recognizing there are multiple voices in the text, and it's not always the case that you are hearing Deleuze and Guattari's voice. Sometimes you're kind of hearing, in a sort of ventriloquized way, the voices of their schizophrenic patients and so on and so forth. So super interesting, and the construction of it is interesting. And a lot of people find that frustrating, but I found it fascinating and continue to find it fascinating. It's something that you can just keep going back to, and you sort of have these moments of revelation and reward when you start to read about it. And like there's embedded throughout the text, there's all kinds of like mini case histories from Guattari's work with the clinic at La Borde. And so you're reading this thing, you think, where the hell does this come from? And then you read something else by Guattari and you say, okay, right, yeah, this is, one of his case histories. So yeah, I think it's a fascinating text. I suppose the thing that was kind of interesting to me in terms of trying to think and write about the notion of everyday life was that sort of internalized fascism that Foucault writes about in the introduction, and the idea that we somehow become attracted to our own submission, and the ways in which our consciousness can kind of be split between wanting freedom and desiring unfreedom at the same time. So I felt then and feel now that that's probably one of the most underutilized aspects of their work, including by me as much as anybody.
Well, it must have really had an impact on you, because I think your thesis was heterology, but it included transcendental empiricism in the title, didn't it?
I think so, yes.
Yeah. So it was a while ago. So it must have had an impact, because presumably you brought that idea through from Deleuze and Guattari.
Yes, specifically Deleuze. So it's really from difference in repetition, which appeared in translation in the middle of my thesis. So I at that time couldn't read French well enough to have read it in French, so I read it in English, and yeah, was quite taken by that idea. So it sort of formed part of the thesis. I think my thesis is absolutely terrible, which is why I've never actually published it. But it was a learning experience for me. It was like this kind of massive encounter between literary texts, philosophical texts, cultural studies texts, and just trying to sort all through that and come up with a sort of synthesis, which I think in retrospect was probably a bit mad. But it was, for me, formative.
Yeah. One of the things I wanted to ask you about was then what your reading practice would be. Presumably this would have been something that you developed reasonably early on. You probably practice it in a refined form today. When you see a new text from a major author that you know you want to immerse yourself in, what's your process? How long do you give yourself? How do you go about it? How do you read a text in a really deep, satisfying way, rather than just, flick as a page turner?
Yeah, I can't read as much as I used to. I don't sleep that well these days, so I'm often quite tired, and reading is something that I can't do in an extended way, in the way that I used to. When I was a postgraduate student, I could read 6 or 7 hours a day,
Wow.
no problem. But now I couldn't read for more than a couple of hours without my eyes just giving out on me. I actually now do most of my reading while sitting on my exercise bike, because that simultaneously keeps me awake and I get my exercise in, and I can't do anything else but read. So I do manage to stay focused. So I read slowly, and I read in sort of bite-sized chunks. So I read a little bit here, a little bit there, and sort of allow it to accumulate. I used to, when I was a postgraduate student, take extensive notes, but then eventually I started to realize that my note taking was kind of interfering with my comprehension of the text, ironically enough, because I wasn't seeing the forest for the trees. I was too busy noting down each individual point and wasn't seeing the big picture. So then I stopped taking notes for a while, and then that wasn't right either. So then I started to try to think, well, what would be the sort of right amount of notes? So I started to then create kind of what I would think of as like a route map, like, this is this key point, this key point, this key point, this leads to this leads to this. And that became quite useful, sort of particularly when I started to give lots of seminars on Deleuze. So I'd have a kind of route map through a text and say, look, we're going to work on this chapter today, and here's the 20 key points that I want to talk us through. I actually think that, one of the reasons why I started the Deleuze camp was that I always thought, and still think, that if you can't teach something, then you don't really know it.
Yeah.
But if you never get the chance to teach it, then how would you ever know that you know it? Yeah. And so I decided to, and I had the opportunity to create Deleuze camp, which I kind of called Deleuze camp mostly as a kind of a joke, because the American Pie, one time at band camp, that always made me laugh. But also I didn't want it to be a summer school. Like, I didn't want people to come there and think that we would be extolling an orthodoxy and that there'd be an exam or anything like that. And I wanted it to be open to anybody, not just students. And it has always been that way. We have everyone from undergraduates to full professors come along and just kind of immerse themselves in Deleuze and Guattari for a week. And I think that's a really great thing. And for me to teach it was fantastic as well. And I absolutely love it, just to be able to try to teach it, to sort of distill everything that I think I know about it and put it into a form that people can latch onto, and then also push back on and ask questions and push me even further. So I think teaching it has become my way of really deeply trying to read something that, I want to read it, I want to teach it, and then I want to write about it. And so it's, for me, it's kind of a reductive process, I suppose. It's sort of winnowing out all the poetry until I get down to a core set of propositions that I think become the basis for a conversation. And that's sort of the point at which you can translate, and you can move from just doing Deleuze stuff to, okay, let's use these propositions or these concepts and ideas to do other things with them. So I think that's sort of become the way I approach it. Like, I want to understand it, and then I think, okay, what could I do with this? And it's that point at which you teach it or try to apply it that I think you really understand it.
That's lovely. Okay, let's move on to your third piece. Now, this isn't a text itself. You've suggested Frederick Jameson's writings, plural, as a collection. Why that? Why all of them? Are they, is it because they're all fabulous?
I think probably I wrote too fast. If I was to narrow it down to one text, it would be probably Marxism and Form. But I find his work, all of it, to be super interesting. And he has a sort of an encyclopedic range. He reads absolutely everything. And I've always admired that. And he reads in French and German, and he can read a bit of Russian. He learned a bit of Chinese. He's also fluent in Italian and Spanish. So he kind of reads everything and is interested in everything. And I just admire that so much.
Do you think he learned those languages so he could read? You mentioned this earlier on about your French not being good enough when you were younger, but presumably it's improved now to be able to read those texts in their original first language. I had a student recently who completed a master's degree, and one of the reviewers suggested reading Deleuze in French, and he speaks only one language, English. And the prospect of learning French so that he could read Deleuze in the first language, I think, was the idea of doing a PhD is daunting, but to do it and learning a new language at the same time. Did you learn French yourself so that you could, or did you learn French because you like to travel in France, you like the language, you like the culture? Was there kind of a, what was the motive?
Not a Francophile. I don't particularly like the culture or want to travel there. No, I learned it specifically so that I could read more of Deleuze, because both Deleuze and Desautours at the time were not translated completely. Deleuze now, I think there's very few texts left that haven't been translated, and including like all the seminars that he gave and so forth, they've all been transcribed and translated. So it's much easier now as a kind of Anglophone to encounter their work. And by no means would I regard myself as fluent, and I certainly don't even really try to speak French. But you can teach yourself to read academic French to a fairly advanced level, because, I mean, academic texts are simplistic, right? Like the sort of the vocabulary range is relatively small. The tense structures are relatively straightforward. They don't really play around with those things so much. So you can kind of get by with a fairly rudimentary understanding of French, at least to begin with. Obviously, the more fluent you become, the better that is, but it's not necessary that you would be at sort of poetry translation levels in order to read Deleuze and Guattari.
So even the fact that they're quite elusive in the way that they write and poetic, I think that was a word you used earlier on. And they're obviously very playful with words and language, and a lot of neologisms appear. How did you cope with those when you came across them? Did you just pull out a dictionary and try to work out what on earth they were talking about?
Often, yes. Or sometimes you would have an English translation that you could refer to and sort of read them side by side, which is what I tend to do now, is just look at them side by side. And I think that's important to continue to do that. And I have written in various places about the ways by which the translations are not so much misleading or wrong, but, inevitably create a slant towards something, and that it's sometimes useful to go back and think, well, what was the original word that they were using, and did it have a range of other meanings that might perhaps be helpful in trying to understand that term. So I talk about it with response in response to the idea of the assemblage, which is
agencement,
quite problematic in relation to agencement. But the other one that's also quite tricky is milieu, which Masumi translates in an unmarked way. Sometimes he leaves it as milieu, sometimes he translates it as middle, which is by no means inaccurate. But the fact that it's unmarked, like that he moves between one and the other, then you go back and look at the original text, you think, it could possibly have been milieu there as well. So it creates a kind of question mark, which I think is important to go back and look at and think, well, did they really mean middle where he's translated middle, or do they actually mean something more like the sociological idea of the milieu? So that's another one that I found it useful to look at and think, well, how would that change how we kind of understand some of their key phrases?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's go back to Jameson's Marxism and Form. That was obviously a very powerful text for you. What is it about that text that really hits you?
So for me, it was the idea of the meta-commentary, which is what I used that phrase for my first book, Deleuzeism. And I was quite taken by that idea of the meta-commentary, which is effectively what I was talking about before, about learning each philosophy as its own kind of a language. And so he approached all philosophy as, here is a new language that we have to learn. Rather than looking to try to either verify it in a sort of philosophical way and say, well, did they get ontology right or wrong? He was more like, well, what version of ontology do they give us? And what does that enable us to see, to think, and to do? So I really like the fact that he was never trying to say, is this right or wrong? There was no gold standard outside of that he was kind of referring to that could say, yes, this is the right way to do things, or no, they just misunderstood ontology. His was always like, well, this is a version of ontology that helps us to see this aspect of life in a new way, or this aspect of a text. So I really appreciated that. But I also like the fact that for him, all texts are political in their own way too. So that all texts are trying to write about a difficult political problem or set of problems in their own way, and that we have to try to understand, well, why do they write about it in this way and not some other way, and how do they enable conversations between different kinds of philosophers. So I found that really powerful as a way of trying to understand Deleuze, that it's, and in a way I think it's inspired by Deleuze, because it's a very immanent approach. And he explicitly says that in The Political Unconscious, that he wanted to construct an immanent form of reading, and he kind of identifies Deleuze-Guattari's Anti-Oedipus as a point of inspiration. And that's why I invited him to the conference the first conference I organized in 1996 in Perth. And people were like, why on earth are you inviting Jameson? I'm like, well, haven't you read The Political Unconscious? It's pretty clear. He is one of the most important Deleuze scholars in the world. But you'd be amazed at how many people got mad at me for even suggesting such a thing.
Really? Yeah, and I also think it points, your comment about it being political points to that that current that's run through a lot of certainly my questions of you around the material practices of these things, of philosophy, as opposed to just a sort of bald metaphysics. I get the impression you're not so interested in mobilizing Deleuze and de Soto and Jameson for purely their metaphysical weight. You're interested in what they can do in the world.
Yes, that's completely true. I've always been, I often joke at conferences and so forth that as far as, ontological debates are concerned, I'm quite happy to believe that stuff exists, and I don't need to debate it much more than that. But I am interested in particularly, I think I would say I'm more interested in ideology than ontology. I'm more interested in the ways by which ideas shape the world, and the ways by which we actively resist good ideas. To me, that's the most pressing problem of our time. And in a way, also we actively resist, kind of, I guess, doing the right thing. Like there are millions of people starving around the world, which is horrific to contemplate, but they're not starving because we lack the food or the resources to enable them to eat well. So how do we end up with a world system that thinks that it is okay to leave these people to starve, that in fact that is the right thing to do? And I just find that bewildering. It's a really, for me, a really serious question. How did we end up with a state of affairs in which that is deemed to be okay by the powers that be?
So going, I mean, beyond stating the bleeding obvious, how do you then decide that something is a good idea?
Um, well, obviously that would always be open for debate, but I think there are some I don't know, kind of basic starting points. Like a good idea would be one that did not intentionally or unintentionally cause harm to others. So it would be quite Spinozist in that sense. Um, and I guess, if your house is burning down, it's a good idea to put the fire out because otherwise you have nowhere to live. So I think there are some problems now that have become so urgent in the need for us to address them, that the good idea is anything that would enable us to address it in a meaningful fashion. But those good ideas should be interrogated, like in the way I was talking about with respect to wind power. Like wind power by itself is not a solution. Um, in this sort of local area here, as I've tried to say to people and annoy them, if we simply turned off all our devices that are in standby mode and switched them off at the wall, according to one calculation I've read, that by itself would save 10% of all our power use, which is far more power than the wind farms will ever generate. So I think good ideas need to be tested and interrogated. And I suppose the question that emerges from that is, where are the underlying interests? Like, is this a good idea because capitalism says it's a good idea, or is it a good idea because it will actually lead to something that would be better for us? So I'm not of the view that we can simply know what a good idea is, but I also think that we should be testing those ideas and finding ways to not to simply turn our back on them because they're too hard or too expensive, or that might require the transformation of a society. So I'm kind of utopian enough to think that we have to confront the so-called impossible.
So maybe without wanting to put words in your mouth, but the issue is not so much what's a good idea as what it would be more, what are the reasons why we exert so much energy in trying not to follow through on good ideas?
Yes, I mean, that's certainly something I think we can study. Like, I think that's what Deleuze and Guattari give us the resources to talk about. And that's one of the reasons why I continue to be very interested in their work, because it seems to me that that's a kind of a key problem in their work as well.
Your fourth selection was Slavoj Žižek's Looking Awry. If Deleuze and Guattari are misunderstood, if Jameson is misunderstood, then surely the crown prince of misunderstood philosophers would be Žižek.
I don't think I would agree with that. I think that that Žižek is the crown prince of creating misunderstandings, or in his more recent work, just not being concerned with understanding anything. Like he says so many things now that are just ridiculous and stupid that it's kind of hard to stay interested in his work. But Looking Awry was and continues to be a real masterpiece of exegesis, of making the otherwise impenetrable work of Lacan, at least in some way, a kind of usable kind of text. Like I found that formative. And I'm by no means a fan of Zizek. I think he says a lot of stupid things. But I am a great admirer of that book. Like he really showed how you can distill concepts down to something that people can use to understand texts and the world around them in a new and different way. Whether you agree or not with his interpretation is less important to me than whether or not you can see how it makes something understandable in a new way. And for me, that was very powerful. And I guess I learned a lot from that. And with my own writing, I kind of reflect on, well, how would I get this concept down to something that you could easily explain to someone such that they could immediately start using it without having to wade through 50 books by Deleuze and Guattari. So I think there's a lot of value in that. I think it's kind of a shame that he has become a kind of a factory and just sort of churns out all these books now, which I'm almost certain that he doesn't actually write himself completely. He's got people helping him with it, and that he has kind of become a victim of his own shtick, whereby he just, and people have started to create memes and jokes about it already, take this obvious idea, turn it on its head and say the absolute opposite, like Trump getting elected would be a really good thing. And, I just think that's idiotic. And I think for me, that was the last straw when I saw him do that video that getting Trump got elected, it would be really great because then America would be forced to confront blah, blah, blah. And you're like, well, no, that's just rubbish. Trump getting elected is a disaster on a number of different fronts. The more important question would be, well, why on earth would people want to vote for somebody like that? Not this would be a good thing in some sort of sterile theoretical sense. So yeah, that was for me the point at which I was like, I'm pretty much done with reading anything Zizek has to say. But nonetheless, one can still learn from his early books a mode of writing and a way of engaging with complex theoretical ideas that can be quite helpful.
Do you think there's a place for people who are deliberately confrontational and provocative, perhaps in a almost sort of nihilistic accelerationist kind of way? And I'm thinking particularly about what Zizek said in the last few years in a political context. I was reading the other day that the most recent American Values Survey, the 2023 data, says that now 25% of Americans believe in one of the three tenets of the QAnon conspiracy, including the fact that the American government's run by a satanic cult of pedophiles, and that forcefully overthrowing the government is a legitimate political strategy. In the face of the insanity of that, and in fact, now the number of Democrats who believe in the QAnon conspiracy has gone from 7 to 14% in the last 2 years. In the face of that insanity, if not Zizek, is there a place for somebody who is literally like a court jester that just is throwing mud at this wall or throwing, comedy pies in the face of this kind of lunacy?
Look, I don't think that is the role of philosophy or critical theory. I think we should be trying to understand things. I think certainly that humor has its place and should definitely be trying to poke fun at these things. But we're now confronted by so much insanity that it's almost impossible to satirize. Like, you can't find a way of satirizing some of these things because they are already so ludicrous that you can't actually believe that they even exist. I'm also mistrustful of practically any survey result that one encounters, because the survey instruments now are administered in ways that are so difficult to know whether or not you've got anything like a representative sample. When somebody wants to find out, what people think about the desire to quit smoking or whatever, you can find a representative sample through fairly reputable sort of survey sampling firms. Like, that's fairly possible because it's quite a narrow band. Like, we've done a survey recently where we're interested in whether or not people would be interested in buying an electric vehicle, and if they did buy an electric vehicle, would they want to put solar on their roof? Like, those kinds of surveys are quite possible. But once you venture out into the realm of beliefs, it then becomes much more difficult to know whether or not that survey is in any way representative of Australia or America or wherever. And like, a lot of the government surveys in Australia still use landlines. Like, who on earth has a landline anymore? So already your survey instrument is default towards a particular kind of demographic. So I'm pretty mistrustful of that. I don't doubt that those kinds of beliefs exist, but the degree to which they're representative of where America is at, who knows? I would be quite skeptical. So yeah, I don't think that Zizek has a place in any of that. I do think that it's more important for us to try to be critical and try to understand these things. And I think one of the things that I have come to think about a lot, and it takes me back to Deleuze's work, is that we kind of, in my view, are not thinking enough about paranoia as a clinical manifestation. Like, you know, people, if they tell you that they're depressed or they're anxious, you're kind of sympathetic to that, and we make allowances for it and so forth. But if somebody says something particularly paranoid, like, you know, I'm an anti-vaxxer or whatever, we tend to think that they're just, well, I do, maybe it's a fault in me, but tend to just think they're an idiot. And we just sort of dismiss it. But what if it wasn't that? What if it wasn't about stupidity, but it was actually a kind of paranoia? Then we would be in the presence of a largely undiagnosed and undealt with clinical phenomenon. And I think that's, for me, that's quite important, because it helps me to want to think differently about those kinds of encounters with people who are anti-vaxxer or whatever. I think, well, why are they so worried about this? And it's completely irrational to be worried about this thing. Like, I've been talked to anti-vaxxers who are also heavy smokers. You're like, well, if you're so concerned about your health, why are you still smoking, for heaven's sake? It's absolutely well known. And then you realize, then they say, oh, it's not really about health, it's about choice. And so I find, that kind of movement of values quite interesting. And that's what Deleuze talks about with the idea of becoming, that the notion of becoming constantly moves, that the value shifts. It's not really about health, it's about choice. It's not really about choice, it's about freedom. It's about this, it's about that. And that's paranoia. And I think would be the great research project to do using Deleuze and Guattari right now. The problem is, if you use any kind of clinical terms, people kind of think, oh, you need to be a psychiatrist or a psychologist to do it. But I don't know that that's necessarily true. And also, people are kind of opposed to those kinds of cultural diagnoses that, people are just, there is a kind of paranoia at work here. But I've always liked the line that Zizek quotes from Lacan, which is, even if people are out to get you, you are still paranoid.
Can you just say a little bit more about what you were just saying about the link between paranoia and becoming? And that you're saying that becoming is, in a sense, a manifestation of paranoia, the constant shifting of values.
Yeah, so if you look at the chapter on becoming animal, etc., in 1,000 Plateaus, one of the things that I eventually noticed that they talk about a lot is that, it starts with a multiplicity of, in the case of the wolfman, a multiplicity of sort of like pustules on his face, and then it becomes a multiplicity of wolves, and then the wolves become something else, become something else, become something else. So the idea of becoming is about the sort of simultaneous mobility of the idea, but also the fact that it is not anchored to anything in particular. And that's what's really striking about paranoia, is that we think that paranoia is a reaction to a particular thing. But when you talk to people who you get the feeling they are paranoid, it's not. It's an all-pervasive concern about something that is never really named, and it just constantly shifts. So you can never pin it down with an appeal to reason. And you say, well, look, the evidence is really clear that mRNA vaccines are perfectly safe, yada, yada, yada. And then they'll say something like, but there's never been a 10-year study. You say, well, no, but mRNA technology has been around for at least 10 years, so we do know it. And then, oh, but they haven't done this and they haven't done this, and it just moves. Like, there is no appeal to a rational, factual kind of anchor point by which you could overturn it. It just keeps, it's like trying to put a pin in a flow of water. And so I think that's quite interesting, and as a kind of cultural phenomenon that we are, I think, surrounded by. And we encounter people who think this way all the time. And I suppose the other part about that is that our political leaders are becoming increasingly aware that they need to try to figure out how to respond to these kinds of ways of viewing the world in their political platforms. So, for instance, in Australia, we currently have the image of a left-wing government. It's not really a left-wing government. And the opposition party is basically just taking the view that whatever the left does, they will be opposed to it. And that's enough for them to generate kind of positive vibes for themselves. And so you then reach the point where the left doesn't want to venture to do anything because they know whatever do good thing that they want to do will simply give ammunition to the right, who will say, oh, it's just a waste of money, it's too woke, it's too this, it's too that. And so the right are always able to appeal to this sort of paranoid sentiment that the very idea of trying to do something good will inevitably lead to the demise. And you could only do something good if you had some sort of underlying kind of desire to do something bad, sort of like with the referendum that we had. And I remember talking to people and they're saying, so what's going on with the referendum? I said, well, it's, pretty simple. It just wants to create the legislative sort of instrument so that Aboriginal people will have a voice to Parliament, but the voice to Parliament as a body will have no legislative power. It won't be able to veto legislation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Ultimately, it's a fairly toothless kind of thing. It's an example of what the fabulous show, to get back to satire, Yes Minister, is a very great scene where he says, well, we had to do something and this was something. And so, in Australia, so we have to do something for Indigenous people and this is something. That's about the limit of what they attempted. And then people were like, well, if it's that toothless, there must be more to it than that. That there is some sort of, thing that there's something that they're not telling us. And you're like, well, no, there's not anything they're not telling us because the legislation proposal is right in front of us. And I had so many conversations with people that just were absolutely convinced there had to be more to it than that. And I just became quite conscious of the sort of paranoid current that runs through contemporary politics that I think social media has just unleashed in a way. It's probably always there, but it didn't have an outlet, didn't have a place to go. And now it can flow onto the internet in a kind of unrestricted way. And in my view, it's changing how politics has to think and work and respond.
Well, I wonder how the person who wrote your fifth choice, Edward Said, would think about all of this had he still been alive. But you've picked Orientalism, which over the course of the last year, interviewed quite a number of people for this site. I think is probably the text that has come up most often. It's really affected. It really has affected a lot of philosophers and thinkers, hasn't it?
Yeah, I would guess so. Although I suppose my reasons would not be the same. I admired it at the level of the sentence. Like I think that there are few books that are as elegantly written at the level of the sentence than that book. And I always give the first chapter to my students as an example of, you would be hard pressed to find a better example of an introduction to a book than this. It puts forward its thesis beautifully, and it lays out all the stakes that are involved in what it wants to do. Whether you agree or disagree doesn't matter, because at least you come away knowing what it was about. And again, it was one of those texts that I only read because as a graduate student, because everybody else was reading it and saying how amazing and important it was and blah, blah, blah. And I wasn't super interested in post-colonial stuff at that time. But I remember reading it and thinking, wow, the erudition that has gone into this, all the books that he refers to and reads, none of it I knew anything about. And so it left me so kind of ridiculously humbled in terms of what I hadn't read, that I remember reading it, putting together a very long list of novels that I had to immediately go and pile up and try to read. And I suppose that's what it has in common with Jameson as well, that there was just this overwhelming and, to me, quite exciting sense of a richness of cultural experiences, texts, novels, plays, operas, and so on, that I just wasn't aware of or kind of dimly knew about but had never really read or encountered. And I just found that really invigorating. Like that's, I guess, more than anything, is what made me want to become a scholar. Because I thought, well, what a great gig to get paid to read all this stuff for the rest of my days. And I continue to think that that's an amazing privilege, and it kind of annoys me a great deal that the university is in Australia anyway, progressively moving away from a model whereby just knowing stuff is regarded as being sufficient reason to have a university. And now it's got to be instrumentalized in all kinds of ways. I remember when I was in Cardiff, I had a colleague there who taught old Icelandic, and he had at best 6 students at any one time. And like in Australia, that would never happen. I can't believe, I would be surprised if there's Icelandic or even old Icelandic taught anywhere in Australia. And I always used to think that is just so fantastic. I just absolutely love the fact that this is being taught. And my concern for the future is that things like that are just disappearing off the curriculum everywhere. And we are going to reach the point where we will look back and think, well, hang on a minute, we don't have anybody who could teach this anymore. Like, we don't have anyone who really knows Shakespeare anymore, who really knows Milton, or who really knows, all these different authors that have just sort of been deemed too old-fashioned to continue to work with now because we're all writing about TikTok. So I think some of the ways by which knowledge is valued, those are the things that I got from Said, that he just values knowledge per se, and he really thinks and wrote in a way that said, writing about Jane Austen is super important. And for me, that's like nostalgic for a version of the university that I have never experienced, but always thought was how university should be. So that is what I got from it initially. Of course, I read it later and read more of his books and began to understand that he, is an important voice for Palestine. And obviously, I would hope people are reading more Said right now as one of the kind of great voices for Palestinian justice and independence and so on. But that was not the reason why I read Orientalism in the first place. It's why I would go back and reread it now, but it was not the reason I read it in the first place.
I mean, you obviously love the craft of writing. You love language. I think your PhD was in English and comparative literature, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So obviously that's a huge influence on you. If you had to put them in some kind of order, would you say that you're a writer or a philosopher or a researcher or as a teacher? What do you think of yourself as first and foremost?
A dilettante? I certainly don't think of myself as a philosopher, and there's no philosophy department probably anywhere in the world that would ever claim me as a philosopher. I suppose I think of myself primarily as a teacher. Like, I really like teaching, and that's why I started the summer schools. It's why I'm always excited when people invite me to come and give graduate seminars and that sort of thing. So I really like teaching. I find teaching first year students increasingly challenging because I think mostly it's an age gap, right? You reach a certain point where you don't sort of feel you can credibly talk to 20-year-olds about their experience. But I do like talking to graduate students who I find it sort of at a level where they're much more interested in the complexities of a text, and that's more, to me, more fun to teach. So yeah, primarily a teacher, and I suppose most of my writing has reflected that. I sent a copy of my book on assemblages to Frederick Jameson, and he wrote back to me and said, "This is fantastic. It's tremendously pedagogic." And I thought, yeah, I think that's a compliment. So I guess, yeah, my attitude is kind of, my way of writing is kind of influenced by that sort of pedagogic desire to try to create something that people can use and learn from, and then go off and do their own thing.
Well, Ian, that's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for your time and those brilliant ideas. It's been I've wanted to have this conversation for at least a year, so it's lovely to finally do this with you. And yeah, thank you very much.
You're very welcome, and I look forward to seeing you in a couple of months.
There we go. I'll stop the recording there. That is absolutely fantastic.